Last week I introduced a study that we're going to be in for six more times, which includes tonight. And I've entitled this series Mad Hatters. Um, a Mad Hatter was a term that uh, originated really a long time ago in the early 1800s, became kind of famous through Lewis Carroll's adventures, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, where the Mad Hatter attends a tea party. But we said that it was an occupational hazard for people in Britain in the early 1800s that used mercury to cure the hats, and it had side effects, and that kind of transitioned into a pop culture mad as a hatter. And it's the idea of kind of things that are quirky, things that are unusual about other people, things that are a bit off. And I thought that would be an interesting way of looking at First Samuel. First and Second Samuel obviously tell the story of David. David's the central character, and the way you break the books down is before David, David's rise to power, and then David's fall from power and from grace. But there's all kinds of other characters that surround David in First and Second Samuel, and these characters all kind of symbolize the political tug of war that was taking place during this period of time. And I picked out six individuals that we're going to look at that represents even some of the tendencies of political figures in our own day and age. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the character of Eli tonight at the beginning of First Samuel. Then next week we're going to talk about Saul, then David, then Absalom, Nabal, and Joab. You might be familiar probably with Saul and David, might not be as familiar with Eli and Absalom, and you might never have even heard of Nabal and Joab, but they're tangible illustrations of this kind of quirky way of operating. Some of them have good intentions that turn bad. Some of them have bad intentions that turn worse. And I've titled the six episodes we'll have in this study Eli the Blind Watchman. Not madness in the sense of being insane, but in the sense of having a spiritual dullness to him, considering his position as a priest. And it really does kind of overflow into his family. He has two very rebellious sons that we will learn about in a few moments. And then we'll move down, and I'll show you this chart each week as we kind of introduce the lesson for that night. So the way to get started really, though, tonight is to understand that even though you have the book of Ruth that is prior to First Samuel, Ruth is kind of a side episode during the period of the previous book, and that is the book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges is really kind of a historical low point in the historical narrative of Israel. There's a lot of violence that took place during the period of the Judges. If we were to take a look at all the episodes in Judges, you'd find everything from gang rape to civil war to mass slaughter. A very violent time. It is characterized in Judges 21:25 as in those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit, or as the old King James Version said, everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And that kind of is the characteristic for hundreds of years. And by the time you get to the beginning of First Samuel, there is this political and religious disarray. Society is kind of cracking at the seams a little bit, and the people are getting anxious. They are fearful, and they will begin to clamor for a king, just like the other nations. Now, the priesthood is established, even though they don't have a king. The priesthood had been established all the way back to Moses and through Leviticus and so forth. And of course, the priesthood was a hereditary type thing. It was passed down from fathers to sons. And there is a character by the name of Eli, who is the priest, as the book of First Samuel opens, and he has two sons. Their names are Hophni and Phinehas. And we're going to see in a moment how corrupt they are. They are individuals that are taking advantage of their position. And in the background sits Eli. And he is not described necessarily as a scoundrel doing the things that his sons are doing, but he's considered kind of old and heavy and dull and blind to what is happening around him, especially in the lives of his two sons. So when you take a look at this period of time, it is a transitional period in Israel's history as it transitions from the time of the judges to the time of the monarchy. And of course, that all kind of centers around David. Pre-David, then David's reign, and then post-David's reign, and so forth. Now, there is the rise of a prophet, and here's where the book gets its name, by the name of Samuel. And he is an individual that provides prophetic leadership. He is surrounded by the priesthood at a very early age, as we'll see in a moment in chapters 1 and 2 and 3. Samuel is basically raised in the temple area. And what we will find is that as Eli transitions his service as a priest to Samuel, it goes fairly smoothly, but that does not continue on. There's all kinds of bumps and starts with the time between Samuel and Saul, and by the time you get the transition from Saul to David, there's all kinds of animosity. Saul is out to kill David, and we'll get to that when we get to some of these other character profiles. But tonight, I want you to see right here that Eli on this timeline here is basically from the period of 1100 through about 1060 BCE, before Christ, before the Common Era. And what you find here is this period is characterized by Philistine oppression, the enemies against Israel. Up here you see a few of the later judges that's recorded in the book of Judges, and probably the most familiar to us is Samson. But by the time you get to 1 Samuel, now you are coming to the end of Eli's service as a priest. You find Samuel stepping into the role as a prophet, and then Saul becomes the first king over the nation of Israel. But that's not how the book begins. Interestingly enough, the way the book begins is by the name of a man who has two wives. And in 1 Samuel chapter 1, before we are introduced to even Eli, it says here in 1 Samuel chapter 1, it says, there was a certain man from the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Elkanah. And Elkanah had two wives. One of them was Hannah, and the other was Peninnah. The difference between the two was Peninnah was able to provide children for Elkanah, but Hannah fits into that profile of a barren woman who is unable to produce children. And she really is in a long line of women that's characterized in that fashion in the Old Testament. You have obviously Sarah in Genesis 17, Rebecca in Genesis 25, Rachel in Genesis 29, the mother of Samson in Judges 13. And then when you fast forward, you have Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1. So this is kind of an ongoing type of motif. Here's a woman unable to have children, and in her anguish, she is crying out to God, and that's where the book of First Samuel opens up. And the way we are introduced to Eli is his inability to discern a woman in grief versus a woman who's drunk. So the way First Samuel 1 goes on, it tells us here that Hannah goes to the temple. And as she goes to the temple, she does so also along with Peninnah, who has all these sons and daughters. And Peninnah is provoking Hannah, making fun of her because she's unable to have children. And verse 7 says, this went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, Peninnah used to provoke Hannah. And then it says, Hannah wept and would not eat. She's had enough, couldn't handle it. And her husband, Elkanah, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? In other words, don't worry about the fact that you don't have children. I'm enough for you. Well, Hannah probably is muttering under her breath, no, you're not. I want to have a child. And in verse 9 it says, after they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself to the Lord. So she's going and she's gonna weep and cry out to God. And then we are introduced to Eli. It says, now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazarite until the day of his death. He shall neither drink wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. So she makes this promise to God that if God opens her womb, she will take the child and dedicate the child to the Lord. Verse 12 says, as she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. Now, the first Mad Hatter that we're looking at is Eli himself having the inability to see a woman in grief versus a woman who had had too much to drink. And so what we find taking place here is a setup, really, for Eli having kind of a spiritual dullness, and he is unable to perceive what he should be able to perceive. What we're told is that the rest of chapter 1 goes on. It says the Lord opens the womb of Hannah, and she has a boy, and she names that boy Samuel. And she fulfills her promise. She takes Samuel to the temple, and she's going to dedicate him, and she's even going to sing a song, and it's called Hannah's Prayer, and it's in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. And we won't read the whole thing, but it's filled with praise and thanksgiving to God because he answered her prayer. But it also elevates God's sovereignty, that he's in control of all of these things, and eventually it is God that opened her womb. Then there's a little bit of prophetic foreshadowing that's taking place here. The very last line of this prayer says this, the Lord, his adversary shall be shattered, the Lord Most High will thunder in heaven, the Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king. Well, they haven't even had a king yet. Saul hasn't even stepped onto the stage yet. So there's kind of this anticipation in her song that eventually there's going to be a king. Well, that might be a prophetic foreshadowing of the Messiah. More than likely, It anticipates something has to change within the societal structure because it is so violent and full of heartache and so forth. Now, this then, Hannah's prayer becomes a model in Judaism. And if you, at Christmas time, will read Mary's Magnificat in the book of Luke, you will find that it is very similar to Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 2. So the prayer is anticipating a few things. That Hannah is going to be able to boast over her enemies. Well, who is her enemy? Well, in 1 Samuel, the enemies of all the people of Israel are the Philistines. But in this context here, her enemy is Peninnah. That is the other wife that is chiding her for not having children. And then what we find, even in this prayer, that Hannah really chides Eli the priest for misunderstanding her grief. And then the rest of the prayer is really the promise of a reversal of fortune for those that are in need. Now, what's interesting is all of a sudden, Hannah disappears from the story. No more is said about her in 1 Samuel. We are told in verse 21, though, of chapter 2, that she has other children. So Samuel is the first. She conceives and has 3 more sons and 2 more daughters. So she has 6 children in total, Samuel being the first. And Samuel is dedicated to the Lord, and she brings him to the temple, and she leaves him in the hands of Eli. Okay, now, there's a little bit of that foreboding music that we can hear in the background. It's not going to go well. Eli has his problems. Eli is an individual that the best way to describe him is he's the priest who nodded off. He sits in the seat, but he's asleep. And Eli is kind of living at this strange crossroads where he's the individual in power. You're kind of transitioning from the time of the judges to the anticipation of the monarchy. But he has the most power, and yet at the same time, he is the individual that is the type of political figure that doesn't really do anything. He just kind of holds the position. And as a result of that, he doesn't stay alert, and he's kind of blind to everything around him. And most importantly, he's blind to his own sons. And it's kind of an indicator here that there's a long, slow drift away from what God intended in the temple and the priesthood. So I'm assuming here, as you can see by the bottom of the screen, that at one time Eli might have been a vibrant, younger priest, but now he's grown old. And he's still wearing the robes of the priesthood, and he's still presiding over the rituals of the priesthood, but his effectiveness has stopped. And so he's kind of like the political and religious leaders who hold positions for long periods of time, and they keep being reelected or holding office, but they don't do anything for the people. And as a result of that, things are going off the rails. The way we see it first going off the rails is in Eli's sons. Now, what we're told is that Eli's sons are individuals that they do not have any respect either for the priesthood nor the servants that were helping out in the temple area. So if you come to chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, it says in verse 22, "Now Eli was very old. He heard all that his sons were doing to Israel and how they lay with women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting." So they're forcing these women in the temple to have sexual relationships with them. If you look up a little bit prior to that verse, um, and I skipped down too soon. If you look at verse 12 in the same chapter, it says, "Now the sons of Eli were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord or for the duties of the priests to the people. When anyone offered a sacrifice, the priest's servants would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and all that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself." So they stick the fork in, they pull up this, and they take this for themselves. And then it goes on. It says, verse 15, "Moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest's servants would come and say to the one who was sacrificing, 'Give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw.' And if the man said to him, 'Let them burn in the fat first, and then take whatever you wish,' he would say, 'No, you must give it now, or if not, I will take it by force.' Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord." So they're doing two things. They're stealing from the commoner, and they are powering up over women and forcing them into sexual relationships. Now, this is a far cry from what Leviticus 24 talks about, some of the behavior that is considered kind of a capital offense under Levitical law. So Eli comes across here as dull, a bad judge of character in the case of Hannah, and blind to his son's corruption. And as a result of that, he is an individual that is taking up space. He's not providing any leadership at all, and he's basically protecting his sons. And so Eli will rebuke his sons a little bit, but it's kind of a soft sell. He talks and says, "Why are you doing this? You should stop this," that type of thing. And this comes across in the first picture of a series of very bad fathers in 1 Samuel, including David, who is a very bad father. Even he might have been a great king, might have been a great leader, terrible father. Eli doesn't seem to be remorseful for the actions of his sons, doesn't take any responsibility for them, even though he's the priest. So this is all kind of a setup here for kind of a madness in the sanctuary, kind of a religion gone bad. I don't think Eli's madness as a Mad Hatter, the first profile, is intentional. I don't think it's intentional. He's just an individual that has let the world pass him by. He kind of sits back and holds a position and doesn't really use the authority that he has to make any changes. Now, what's interesting is in the background are the Philistines. And the Philistines are the continued enemies of the nation of Israel. We saw that back in Judges when Samson and the Philistines episode takes place. But they continue to be the enemies of the nation of Israel. There is the holy place, and inside the holy place of the temple is the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant becomes a kind of a superstition for the nation of Israel. If we take the Ark of the Covenant with us into battle, we will win the battle. Now, what we're seeing is kind of a drifting here, and then at the same time, in chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, you have a spotlight on Samuel, who is not dull and blind, even at a very young age. So there's a setup of contrast in chapter 3, verse 2, when it says, or actually verse 1, "Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. And at that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. And Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. And then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel. And this occurs 3 times. Samuel thinks Eli is calling him. And finally, Eli realizes that Samuel is hearing the word of the Lord. And it says in verse 7, now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. But the word of the Lord should have been very apparent to Eli. He was the priest. He's the intercessor. Verse 8 in chapter 3 says, the Lord called Samuel again a 3rd time, and he got up and he went to Eli and he said, here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived, finally he sees something, that the Lord was calling the boy. And therefore Eli said to Samuel, go lie down, and if he calls you, you say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Wow, what a contrast. Eli, blind. Eli, not listening. Samuel has vision. Samuel hears the word of the Lord. And so God is going to speak to Samuel. And even Eli, in kind of his lethargic way of approaching his position as a priest at this elderly age, has this moment of grace. He has this insight. Oh, the Lord is speaking to Samuel. And he says, go and say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Well, Eli doesn't realize that the first thing that Samuel's going to learn is the fate of Eli and his sons. And if you come down in chapter 3, verse 15, it says, Samuel lay there till morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he said, here I am. Eli says, what was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May the Lord do so to you, and more so if you hide anything from me of all that he told you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Well, what is it that the Lord told Samuel? Well, basically, the Lord told Samuel that Eli and his sons are going to die, and so now Eli is given this vision. Probably didn't really want to hear, obviously, what he heard, and that becomes the setup for chapter 4, where we do find the death of Eli's sons in their battle against the Philistines. Now, before we get there to Eli's sons, look at the character traits of Eli. He's devout, but he's dull-spirited. He's being faithful to God, but he's not using wisdom. He remains at the temple. He maintains the rituals, but he doesn't have discernment. He mistakes Hannah's prayer for drunkenness. His physical blindness, I think, is meant to be kind of a symbol of the spiritual blindness to all those that are around him. So it's kind of symbolism. His eyes are kind of a metaphor for the dim vision of the world around him. Secondly, he's a loving but a weak father. He loves his sons, but he's not strong enough to confront them for what they're doing at the temple. What we're told in chapter 2, verse 12 of 1 Samuel is that Eli's sons were scoundrels. Interesting term. I'll show you in a moment. That's used one other time in the book of Judges, but let's hold on to that for a second. They tend to exploit the worshipers who are coming to offer sacrifices. They desecrate the sacrifices. They desecrate the women who are there serving. Eli rebukes them in chapter 2, but he could have removed them from their position. He had the power to do that, but he doesn't do so. Thirdly, he is a reverent mentor to Samuel. Um, for all that he does wrong, he does have the insight to tell Samuel, go and listen and say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And so, even in all the shortcomings of Eli, there's this act of insight, an act of faithfulness. That here is Samuel, who is eventually going to replace him in his position. And in a sense, he's handing over eventually his priestly role to another. And then, fourthly, he kind of stands as a tragic figure of transition. Um, his death, that I'll show you in a moment, is really symbolic and deeply tragic because in chapter 4, what we're told prior to the death of Eli and his sons, we're told about the capture of the Ark of the Covenant. So when you come to chapter 4, it starts and says, Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. In those days, the Philistines mustered for war against Israel, and Israel went out to battle against them. So you're going to have another skirmish that takes place here. But this time, what we're told is in verse 3, when the troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord put us to rout today before the Philistines? So they're losing the battle on the field. They lose 4,000 men. And so they come up with this idea. Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, so that he may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. In other words, we need the Ark of the Covenant to be our silver bullet, our magic weapon. And again, Eli could have stepped in here and said, no, you're not taking the Ark of the Covenant out. It's staying in the temple of the Lord. But they take it. And what we find is it goes down and says in verse 4, so the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. So there's this idea of God's with them because he's sitting there in the Ark of the Covenant. The two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. And when the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout so that the earth resounded. In other words, yay, we're going to win the battle. This is what we need. We need the Ark of the Covenant. So it goes on and says here in chapter 4 that the Philistines, they become afraid. They become afraid of the fact that they have the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so notice here, again, we're already told that Eli has two sons, and these Hophni and Phinehas, they're bringing out the Ark of the Covenant. So it's almost as if they're the ones that is pushing for this. Now, remember what I said about them being scoundrels, okay? That word in Hebrew, Belial, is used one other time in the Old Testament, back in the book of Judges, chapter 19, verse 22, and it's used of the men of Gibeah who threatened to gang rape a Levite, okay? And then they murder a concubine. And you can go back and read that if you'd like. They don't have any regard for the Lord. They don't submit to God either. So as far as what we see here, these two scoundrels, the sons of Eli, almost indict him to be a scoundrel too. However, we see a little bit of a softer side of Eli. That's why I think he's more blind than belligerent. And but these scoundrels here, um, they're the ones that drag out the Ark of the Covenant, and all the people think they cannot lose. However, they do. Verse 10. So the Philistines fought. Israel was defeated and they fled, everyone to his home. There was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. 30,000. The ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So they die in battle. Now the word is going to come back to Eli. And we're told that Eli is 99 years old at the time, verse 15. Now Eli was 98 years old, not 99, 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. He's blind now. The man said to Eli, I have just come from battle. I have fled from the battle today. And he said, how did it go, my son? And the messenger replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the troops. Your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. And when he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. So he's a priest, but he's also a judge, and he is blind, he's heavy, he's lethargic, and now he's grief-struck because his sons die and the Ark of the Covenant has been captured. So we might say the fall of the house of Eli represents kind of an older religious order that's kind of collapsing under its own weight, sort of like Eli collapses under the chair that was holding him. And what we find is that the book is saying it's time for a new voice. It's time for a new leader. And that person is Samuel. Eli kind of represents the madness of the religious inertia that took place from the time of the judges into the time of the transition to monarchy. And he's kind of a weary guardian of a dying system. And yet, even there, God in his grace whispers to a child, to Samuel, and Samuel's given a vision. And what we find is that this new work is going to take place under a new way. So Eli's legacy, I think, is tragic. I guess you could accuse him of being a scoundrel in a way, but I don't think he's as villainous as his sons. I do think he is an individual that represents a generation that has kept the religious rituals but lost the vision of it. And I think that's where we are in our history as a country. Christian nationalism is trying to keep certain religious rituals in place, but they lost the vision. And as a result, we live in a chaotic time as well, blind, unable to hear the word of the Lord. What we find is that there is a word that is given to Samuel in verse 18 of chapter 3. And after Samuel tells Eli everything, there is this moment where I guess there's this resignation on the part of Eli. It is the Lord who's talking to you, Samuel. Let him do whatever seems good to him. He, while has kind of lost the storyline, still has this moment of insight that God is on the throne. Let God do what God is going to do. Don't get in the way. So maybe the way to apply this lesson tonight is the dim eyes of a dying age. represents the old, um, does not get his sons out of the way so that God can do a new work under a new leader, um, but continues to hold on to the position of power and wants to allow his sons to continue to do the same, even though they're misusing their power and taking advantage of the people that are coming to make a sacrifice, certainly violating the women that are there serving within the temple. Um, so his eyes are dim, but there's this light that is still flickering a little bit. And it's this idea that um, there's just enough light to show the way for Samuel, that a new way needs to come into the life of the nation. And this is a great story of how eventually institutions need to fail and to fall to make way for something better. And God is still speaking, even in the midst of all that. And it's interesting that who he is speaking to is the smallest one, the youngest one, but yet the one who's willing to hear, willing to listen, willing to give his life. And that's what Samuel did. He was dedicated as a baby, and he has a Nazarite vow that he holds to, and so forth. And we'll know a little bit more about Samuel as we go through this. But in chapter 4, it ends with this very ominous statement. So Phineas, one of the sons of Eli, has a wife who's pregnant. So she's going to give birth to a son. The Ark of the Covenant has been captured. And when the Ark of the Covenant has been captured, her husband dies in battle. And it says down in verse 19, now his daughter-in-law, Eli's daughter-in-law, the wife of Phineas, was pregnant, about to give birth, when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead. She bowed and gave birth, for her labor pains overwhelmed her. And as she was about to die, the women attending her said to her, do not be afraid, for you have borne a son. But she did not answer or give heed. She named the child Ichabod, which means the glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God has been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. She said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. Now this becomes a interesting storyline in itself. So the ark is captured, and she says the glory of God has departed from Israel. What's going to happen is the Philistines, and you can kind of see this map here, oops, that the Ark of the Covenant is initially taken to the battlefield in Shiloh here. It is captured when the Philistines defeat the nation of Israel. They are going to take the Ark of the Covenant back to a city called Ashdod, and they're going to put it into the temple of Dagon. They're going to hold it for a while until eventually they realize it's not good to hold on to the Ark of the Covenant. And they're going to return the Ark of the Covenant back to Israel. And as it is returned, the Ark of the Covenant is kept here at a place called Kiriath Jearim until David takes his reign, and then he will eventually bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem to place into the temple that his son Solomon will build. And so the glory is departed, but it's not gone for good. And this period of time is still kind of characteristic of the time of the judges. It's darkness. What's going to happen? The Philistines are at our front door. Are we going to be destroyed? We don't have the Ark of the Covenant, and so forth. Now, could it possibly be that this storyline is a setup, obviously, for the rise of David to be the the epitome of the type of king that the nation wants? Now, Saul will fall short of that. We'll see that next week. But it could represent something more. It could represent nations that continue to hold on to heavy traditions and rituals and power brokering and bribery and all kinds of stuff like that, but they lack wisdom. And as a result, they die off. And then new movements need to take place. New movements need to rise up. So perhaps what it's showing symbolically in the text is how our religion, our politics, and even our morality um, often goes unquestioned and are given certain black and white answers rather than understanding, is God saying something? Is God moving in a new way? And how are we to adjust to that? How should we adapt to that? How can we stay soft to the voice of God? Um, and yet, I think one of the tendencies of all of us as human beings is we fall into this pattern of certainty rather than humility. And in certainty, we lose our ability to hear the mystery of God's ways that are continuing to unfold into the ages that are even beyond our own lives. So, like Eli and even his sons, often we treat our traditions as our property to use as we want and to exploit them to our own advantages. And but the Spirit of God has moved on. The glory is departed, Ichabod. And Phineas's wife got it right. For now, they sit in darkness until God will use Samuel to raise up a different type of leadership that will come to its epitome and apex under David. So, is there any hope in this storyline of Eli's life? Yes, God still speaks, and sometimes he speaks in the darkness, sometimes he speaks in the night, and God gives a new word, um, and and we have to be quiet enough to hear it, to see it, and then when these old systems fall silent, when they don't give meaning or purpose anymore, it doesn't mean that God has forsaken us. It means that we need to continue to hear of a better way of doing life, a better way of leading people, and I think that's the big story that we have here, and it's one of those ways of making an old story new in our own day and age. So let me stop our recording, and we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about some of these things.